Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We are so happy and excited to have you with us today. My name is Jared Fitzpatrick, and I am on the Canaries team focused on user engagement and outreach. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm joined by my colleague from Canaries, Stacy, who is our Director of Business Development. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First, to ensure that everyone can hear during the discussion and there are no distractions, we'll ask that everyone keeps your microphone on mute. If you do have any audio or video trouble, you can message Stacy and she can provide instructions to help. Second, this is an interactive session and we want to hear your questions. You can ask questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom during the webinar, and we'll also reserve 15 minutes at the end of the discussion to answer all of your questions. Last thing, this session is being recorded and the recording will be emailed to all of the attendees after the webinar. While we have a few people joining us still, I'd also like to encourage you all to share your LinkedIn profiles with each other using the chat feature so that you can network and stay connected even after the webinar. All right, so for those of you just joining us, again, welcome. So my initial exposure to diversity and inclusion came from leading employee resource groups and managing organizational transformation projects when I worked as a management consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers. And that's where I met our speaker today, Lisa Ong. And when I made the leap into full-time diversity and inclusion and culture work, I realized quickly that there was a gap between what diversity and inclusion initiatives were designed to do and the actual outcomes that they were seeing. And that's really where I found Canaries. And for those of you who don't know, Canaries is a platform with a mission to improve workplace culture and to foster more inclusive environments. So on our Canaries website, and it's K-A-N-A-R-Y-S, people can automatically and anonymously rate their employers on issues related to the lived experiences of their diverse backgrounds. People can also share information related to benefits, employee resource groups, and policies focused on diversity, inclusion, and equity. And in the next coming weeks, we'll actually have a job board posted on our Canaries website, so you can go there, post jobs, and people who are interested in working for different various employers who come from diverse backgrounds can go there and apply for those jobs. We recognize at Canaries that the information that we provide to companies, while anonymous, is helping them to make data-driven decisions on their D&I initiatives, and we don't take that lightly. And when companies partner with us, they receive personalized, customized dashboards that are really tailored to their diversity and inclusion metrics that help them create real change instead of these check-the-box initiatives. So as part of our ongoing commitment to support inclusion and diversity and inclusion leaders, we created this multi-part webinar series where we're focused on helping D&I and HR leaders advance diversity and inclusion during the COVID-19 pandemic. So last week we heard from Bobby Griffin, the global head of diversity and inclusion at CBRE, and he spoke about how culture is revealed in crisis. And today we're thrilled, and I'm so happy to have Lisa Ong, the president and founder of Wishing Out Loud LLC, with us to have a candid conversation on what employers may not know about COVID-19's impact on Asian American and Pacific Islander. So Lisa, thank you so much for being here with us today. So happy to have you. Lisa is an executive coach, speaker, diversity strategist, and consultant. She specializes in diversity and inclusion, leadership development, coaching, and facilitation. Prior to founding Wishing Out Loud, Lisa was a national diversity director in the National Office of Diversity and Inclusion at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. She designed strategies to retain, develop, and advance diverse talent. She focused on minority retention and advancement efforts, as well as growing inclusive leaders at all levels. She's widely known as a talent gardener and an inclusion connector. She helps individuals to achieve their goals with an emphasis on leadership skills to foster meaningful relationships. She shares her coaching approach with her clients to discover their strengths, dream big, and keep strategically wishing out loud to create opportunities to shine and be their best. Lisa is an accomplished business professional with experience in public accounting and human capital talent management. She earned her Bachelor of Business Administration degree from the University of Texas at Dallas. She is a Texas Certified Public Accountant, CPA, and a professional certified coach by the International Coaching Federation. She's also certified in the Leadership Circle 360 tool, and she earned her Master of Science in Management from the University of Texas at Dallas. She speaks on topics ranging from unconscious bias, bridging cultural differences, authentic leadership, building meaningful relationships, communicating with impact through storytelling and networking, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Her recent awards include being named to the DCEO magazine's Dallas 500 as one of the 2020 most powerful business leaders in DFW in the Corporate Diversity Officer category. She was also named in the Dallas CPA Society one of the 2019 CPAs of the Year, and the Dallas Business Journal recognized her with a 2017 Minority Business Leaders Award for her leadership in business and in the community. And on a personal note, Lisa is one of the first people who introduced me to the world of diversity and inclusion. She has been a constant and very thoughtful and patient advocate for me, and she continues to be that for me as a mentor today. So thank you again, Lisa, for being here.
Thank you, Jared, for that warm introduction. I hope to take you on the road with me to do this more. Thank you. So I have to tell you, when you asked me to speak on this topic, I hesitated. And the reason I hesitate is my approach to inclusion is always no fear, shame, or blame, right? I don't want people to feel like they should be guilty for something. But I felt personally called to speak on this topic because I felt like there was a number of individuals who were suffering in silence, and they weren't equipped to really deal with this amount of hate and harassment that was coming their way. And personally, I struggled with it myself. How do we speak up without sounding defensive? How do we speak up when we're feeling embarrassed or shame? And why should we feel shame? So culturally, I'm third generation Chinese American. So a lot of the cultural values that I was raised on that have helped me be successful today sometimes get in the way of being the leader I want to be. So because I respect others and because I assume that everyone is good, I didn't want to use the word racist. But when you look at some of these continued rising attacks and harassment, it is what it is. So we have to be willing to lean into these conversations and say, what can we do to stop and mitigate this bias, and what's working, and what can we do more of? Personally, this has been something that's hit home for me. A lot of my relatives are in New York City. My 38-week pregnant cousin was at the grocery store this weekend, just waiting in line to get in for some last minute things with her husband, and they were verbally attacked. She was personally verbally attacked by someone in line because she was tired waiting in line and she leaned on her husband for some rest. And they yelled at her and said, if you're feeling sick, you should stay home. You should go back to China. She's born here just like I am. So some of these biases have existed for a long time. I think COVID has brought some of that unconscious bias and simmering prejudice against certain groups to the surface. And I knew that always existed because when I travel around the country speaking, people will always ask, where are you from? And I'll say Dallas, Texas, and I'll try to use a little bit of a Texas drawl to give them a hint. And they'll say, no, where are you really from? And it's because I understand that when you look Asian, they automatically assume foreign, right? And so knowing that in situations where people are feeling a lot of fear from uncertainty right now, there is a tendency in the brain to blame others. So I'm glad we're having this conversation today because I think we can't solve for inclusion unless we talk about what exclusion feels like.
Wow. That story is just, it hits home. And I mean, just thinking through what that would feel like. It's crazy. But I want to understand, because you're absolutely right. There has been a lot of hate, and xenophobia is a word that we're hearing more and more every day. But it's, racism is a core component of why there's so many violent attacks, but even, written or emotional attacks. So outside of just what you shared with us, are there any other ways that you've really seen this virus impact your personal or your professional life?
Well, personally, I'm actually much more self-aware when I go outside for walks. One of our neighbors reported getting thrown a water bottle. He was just walking down the street, and he's Asian. Someone threw a water bottle and hit him in the arm. He has a huge bruise. So now I'm a lot more aware of my surroundings than I probably normally would have been. So that's another personal issue. The other thing is the heaviness you feel in your heart, because part of me says you shouldn't complain because there's a lot more worse things going on out there. People are dying. People are, on the front lines doing their best. Families are making huge sacrifices, right? How can you say, well, your group is feeling threatened? But I think if we don't raise awareness of the dangers of the threat and the hate mongering and the results of what that does to encourage other people to feel more safe in attacking others, we're in a bad place. And when I think about inclusion, and that's what all of us are here about, we're champions for inclusion. Inclusion is the antidote to hate and fear, right? Hate and violence and fear is peace and inclusion, because we all yearn to belong and we all want to feel safe. So one of the things that I was starting to feel sad about was, even before we had the shutdown, I saw that the Asian restaurants were taking a huge hit. People were not visiting Asian restaurants. I didn't see that same level of avoidance when, Italy was having high numbers of individuals coming down with the virus too, but it goes to that visual dimension of diversity, right? Sometimes you can't hide from the fact that you do look Asian, even if you're not. So having to understand, well, how do you have these conversations in a way that helps people understand but not feel guilty, and what do they do with that? What do you wish for them to do differently with it? And I asked somebody, I said, when you see these things happening, how come you don't feel comfortable saying something, right? You know it's not nice, you know it's not kind. What's holding you back from saying something? And the fear is real, right? People don't want to get involved, right? Someone's like, I'm not going to say anything because I'm hoping someone else says something. But in the meantime, that person that's the victim is all by themselves. So what can we train our employees to do if they want to stand up for others, right, in a safe way, right? I don't want them to run around saying you're a racist, you're discriminating, and possibly escalating the violence, but giving them tools to be able to de-escalate the violence, right? My daughter accuses me of having a tough mommy voice, right? So I can ask people, could you channel your mommy voice and say, hey, stop that. That's not kind, right? Doesn't have to say you're discriminating or you're racist. Or you can say, could you please stop what you're doing now, or take the person that's being attacked to somewhere safe. But that person being attacked needs to feel seen and heard, that they're not alone. And oftentimes what happens is, if one person says, hey, that's not nice, 2 or 3 other people will start to feel more emboldened to also stand up. In the case of my cousin waiting in line, thank goodness there were 2 people in line that saw what happened and intervened. They said, you're not being nice, you're not being appropriate, you're showing your stupidity, right? And they escorted her and her husband to the front of the line to the store manager to protect them. She was terrified. She was like, Lisa, I couldn't say anything even though I was defensive, because I have a 38-week-old baby in my stomach. If they start punching, I was worried for the baby. And so that really brought it home and real for me, that we need bystanders to see something and say something. And if you hear one person say something, please be the echo, because there's safety in numbers.
Wow. I'm glad that you talked about that. We call it upstanders, right? We constantly talk about not being a bystander, being an upstander, and that's more important now than truly ever. So Canaries recently posted an article with action steps for D&I professionals specifically to support their Asian employees. And it talks about exactly what you just said: reinforcing anti-discrimination policies, raising awareness about how the virus spreads, encouraging people to be upstanders. But more than just supporting, a lot of HR and D&I leaders, they really want to understand the experience of what their Asian employees are going through. But that's not always easy to get out of them. So how would you recommend D&I leaders to encourage their Asian employees and other people of color to share their professional and their personal experiences related to what they're going through?
Yeah, Jared, that's a really tough challenge, right? Because you have to put your cultural lens on it. So I often share with people that when I first started with the company, I never shared anything about my family because I was raised where what goes on at home stays at home, right? Vegas rules. So now all of a sudden you're asking about my personal life. That feels a little scary, right? How do you get someone to open up? And when I'm coaching leaders, they'll say, Lisa, I'm so frustrated. I know somebody's tired and exhausted and I'm worried about them. And I'll say, hey, how are you today? And I get 99% of the time, I get busy or fine, right? Everything's fine, ma'am. Everything's fine, sir. And he says, I can tell it's not the case. What can I do differently to get a different result? And I said, if you're working with a group that needs trust to be able to open up, you may need to share a story first. And also, if they are fearful of being seen as the problem, right? I don't want to tattle. I don't want to be a whiner. But I do want to be helpful to you. How do you repivot the question so that it gets the answer you need? So one of the leaders used to say, Lisa, they keep quitting on me before I even have a chance to find out what the problem is. And I said, well, why don't you reframe the question? Why don't you say, I'm concerned about the high turnover of our Pan-Asian talent. If you were me, what's one thing you might do differently to help us be a better destination for Asian talent? Or I know our Asian talent are experiencing a lot of acts of xenophobia out in the community. Right? What are you seeing? It takes it away a little bit indirectly versus direct, right? In terms of if I'm trying to make sure I'm showing you respect as my boss, right? That power distance and respect for hierarchy, I'm more willing to speak up and help if I'm speaking up on behalf of others, not being the whiner myself. Now, I also want to be caveat as an inclusion leader that I'm not speaking on behalf of all Asians. I'm speaking from my own experience in coaching many Asian mentees, and even being on the receiving end of those questions, right? That I didn't want to be the troublemaker. I don't want to complain. I'm just happy to be here. But when you're struggling with a lot of things outside of work, your first inclination is not to run and tell your boss, right? You're trying to put on your game face for your boss. In fact, you know, poker face skills come in handy at work, right? That everything's fine. But I got that tough message when I was a new manager that, Lisa, if you're always putting on that positive game face, how can you expect people to follow you, right? Because you're so serious and you're so intense and you're not allowing other people to be vulnerable. You're not allowing people to say, gosh, I'm really having a bad day. So when a leader calls me and says, gosh, I'm having a really bad day, whew, that just makes it easier for me to say, you know what, I'm having a bad day too. But when a leader gets on a call and says, we're going to tough through this and we're all of this together and everything's good, does that give me any space to say not so good from where I'm sitting, right? From where I'm sitting, COVID's causing a clash not only of cooking, cleaning, caregiving, elder caregiving, teaching, and career, but, you know, how you layer on culture too. Wow. So before COVID, we had a number of Asian employees who were juggling elder care. And a lot of times that doesn't come up. People, when they talk about work from home, talk about childcare. But in the Asian community, caring for your elders, sometimes two sets of parents living with you is not a normal. And then you think about the language difference of caring for those individuals. It's not easy to care for individuals that need caregivers that speak a different language. So when we were trying to find my mother-in-law help, right, in Texas, it was much easier to find caregivers who spoke Spanish than Mandarin. So just thinking about all those layers that make the difficulty even better or harder makes me appreciate it. But as I was thinking about this conversation, I was trying not to paint Asians and Asian women as needy. I was trying to reframe it as these are your gritty, resilient folks who are in the trenches making things happen, and you don't even realize it. And some of that bias is coming in on conference calls, especially with Zoom. There's this thing that, oh, if you're not turning on your camera, you must be hiding something, right? Well, if I'm cooking dinner and teaching my child to the left, and we only have one home computer that has a video camera, and the internet is Wi-Fi is going in and out. Yeah, I might need a little grace, but am I going to say that, right? So I just ask employers to think about that. Just because someone is not turning on their camera does not mean they're fully committed.
Wow. All right, you're dropping knowledge. I love it. This is amazing. Okay, so I'm going to be I'm going to move forward on the questions, and I know that we have some other questions that are coming in, and so if you do have questions, you can just type them into the Q&A box, and we will address those once we get to the end of this portion. So the next question I had for you, Lisa, we know, and it's been clearly documented, that the virus is not transmitted based on ethnicity, race, any of those factors. However, we have seen disparate health impacts and economic impacts on people of color. For example, Black and Hispanic people are dying at a higher rate, primarily because of chronic health conditions. So what are some of the things that companies and leaders need to be doing or thinking about to keep their employees healthy?
Yeah, unfortunately, COVID has highlighted some of these inequities that have been around systemically for a while. So lack of access to quality health care, to quality nutrition, can lead to these types of outcomes. And so are companies not only taking care of their employees within their walls, but are they looking at their corporate social responsibility outreach to say, how are we taking care of the communities where our employees come from as well? And I've been seeing some really great, heartening examples of companies focusing in on that in terms of how do we get healthier foods to where the food deserts are in the city? How can we help support mobile medical trucks to get to where they need? Even access to Wi-Fi to book a doctor's appointment. Nowadays, all the doctors are on telehealth. So if you don't have quality Wi-Fi, they can't even see you. You're trying to do a doctor's appointment by phone if you're lucky. The other thing about employee benefits that I've noticed is some groups may not take advantage of them as much as others. So while you may have an employee assistance program that offers assistance for when you're stressed or anxious, maybe free therapy or free counseling, some groups, there's a stigma around therapy and counseling because they haven't seen leaders from their communities talking about the value of seeking therapy and counseling. And if you think about the disparate impact on people of color and all of that death, grief is one of those life things that just hits you out of nowhere. And unless you've gone through it before, you just don't know how to deal with it. And so in the Asian community, when you look at the stats, the number 2 killer for young people below 24 is suicide, right? It's a quiet group. They're by themselves. They're now in social isolation. So how do we continue to make sure that they are actively seeking that help that they need? And it's difficult because I've talked to several people who said, Lisa, I thought that therapy and counseling and those types of mental health resources were only for when I'm really, really bad off, right? I was like, well, no, it's supposed to make sure you have that resource and help before you get really, really bad off. Right. So when I was going through a period of time where I lost 2 dear loved ones all in the same month, right, I was like, I think I got this. I'm fine. Then I realized as much as you think you're fine, your body is going to tell you you're not fine. Right. And you shouldn't wait till you get that bad to seek the counseling because, I mean, if I broke my arm, I wouldn't say, oh, it's not that bad, I'll just wait. I'd go to the doctor right away. So we have to be able to frame that in a way that all groups feel more comfortable lessening the stigma of seeking mental health resources too.
I love that. We could spend a lot more time there. I'm gonna move forward, but I do want to just highlight one thing that you mentioned there, and it ties in with what you mentioned earlier about leaders needing to be vulnerable. It's just the fact that you are setting the example by sharing your story, but that's something that leaders often struggle to do, especially around emotional and mental health. So that's really important. Okay. Oh my gosh, you're dropping so many nuggets of knowledge. I love it. So I'm going to shift a little bit and I'm going to talk about some money issues, right? Because many HR leaders are facing this crisis situation right now And in the midst of that, there's budget cuts because companies are struggling. Right? So if HR budgets are getting cut, which oftentimes they are the first to get cut, what can leaders do to maintain that positive momentum that they may have been gaining with diversity and inclusion, potentially less funds?
Well, Jared, you know me, I love to talk about diversity on a dime. I don't want to feed an Asian stereotype that I'm scrappy or maybe cheap, but when I first started with my diversity practice, I started with zero. And even when I work with my clients, I assume we have a zero-based budget. We're going to build the business case for increasing that budget, right? Because if you think about inclusion, it's all about getting together and building those connections. It doesn't have to take a lot of money. So I look for opportunities of what's working well in the organization that's not going to cost me a lot of money. It doesn't cost me a lot of money to set up a Zoom call. It doesn't cost me a lot of money to reserve the first Friday of the month, the conference room, to do a brown bag lunch. I think I was the queen of the brown bag lunch. Bring your own lunch and I'll bring the cookies and sodas from the store, right? And I always did Girl Scout cookies for diversity inclusion leaders supporting Girl Scouts, right? As leaders, I get a discount because it's charity too. But I think I would cross the notion off that you need a lot of money to do diversity inclusion and focus on what matters. And it's building those connections and meaningful relationships to make sure the employees feel heard and acknowledged and plugged in, and more importantly, that they're not alone, right? So this is the ideal time to leverage your employee resource groups. Right? They're doing a lot of exciting things on Zoom, things that they would have never probably creatively pushed themselves to do before, which is not costing the company anything. I'm seeing a lot of social happy hours, yoga, karaoke, dumpling making parties, dancing, TikTok dancing lessons, all sorts of fun things that they may not have done before in the office environment.
I love that diversity on the dime. That is definitely your thing, and you made it. I mean, just coming from my experience when I was at PwC with you, you made the diversity and inclusion activities we did fun. So you definitely talked about some great things there, and you know, I know that there's probably people on the call who are thinking through, well, those are some good ideas, but how can I, you know, continue to find new ideas, or you know, what other resources are out there? Do you have anything that you could share, different resources for people to go and learn about more opportunities?
So Jared, I'm all about free resources. Everybody knows that's why they call me the Inclusion Connector. I probably have like 10 or 20 free things I share with everyone, because if it's free, why not? We don't compete in the diversity and inclusion space, right? All boats rise when we can get in the boat and roll in the same direction. So some of the free resources in the Pan-Asian space that I highly recommend is, I'm a lifetime member of Ascend. And Ascend is a national Pan-Asian professional business organization. It's a life cycle organization. They have 18 professional chapters, over 30, 40 student chapters, everything from students to senior executives. I've been a member for over 15 years. And it takes a lot of the heavy lifting work for content off of the ERG leaders' plates, because for their annual membership, they can send their members to the monthly events and webinars now for next to nothing. And the content and speakers are wonderful. So the website there is ascendleadership.org. They also put out great thought leadership papers from the Ascend Foundation on their website for free, right? It talks about, you know, hidden in plain sight, how do you unleash your Asian talent, right? How they could be potentially overlooked. If you're looking at performance through the lens of who raises their hand for more work, who's being energetic on the calls, well, if they're juggling a lot of stuff at home, they're certainly not going to be raising their hands right now. So how do you make sure you don't overlook them coming out of that? And Ascend's been really great about highlighting the strength of the Asian talent. The other group I use a lot is Tannenbaum. And Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding has been a real great resource for me, particularly like during Ramadan right now. I want to make sure I'm up to speed on when is the different religious holidays, and are we being inclusive to all employees of all faiths as well as no faith, right? So let's make sure we're inclusive on both ends. And their workplace resources for free and their fact sheets are really helpful to keep it focused on, this is how you can support your employees who are observing religious observances during this time. The other one that I use a lot, which may seem a little different, is Accents International. Now, you do have to pay, but what's great about it is you can introduce it to your employees and let your employees pay for it. So what it responds to is oftentimes I hear, well, Lisa, my reason for fear of speaking up is not because I'm afraid to offer a new idea. It's mainly because I'm afraid that I won't be heard because of my accent. Because there's an accent bias, not if you don't have a Texas accent, but if you don't have a certain accent, they won't listen to you. And so I don't like to call it accent reduction as much as powerful pronunciation. And so they're desperate for, I know that effective communication skills is what I need to advance to the next level, but we don't have that kind of leadership development training here. Well, how can I do a deeper dive into the actual language linguistics to make sure I'm pronouncing everything correctly to be more confident when I show up? And so they teach, they have a virtual platform. It's Brady Bunch style. You can do individuals and groups. And I highly recommend that for individuals who are looking to improve their powerful pronunciation.
I love that. I love powerful pronunciation.
Did you want resources beyond the Pan-Asian space as well?
Well, I know you have a wealth of resources. If you wanted to share maybe one or two more, that's absolutely fine. And then we'll turn it over to some of the questions we've received from the audience.
So the other question I get is, well, Lisa, how do you get so much knowledge? Okay, I listen to podcasts probably 8 to 10 hours a week, webinars, right? I'm an avid reader, and I'm active in LinkedIn groups. So if you haven't discovered the power of the LinkedIn groups and following the LinkedIn hashtags around diversity, inclusion, and equity and belonging, I get a lot of great feeds and resources from my peers in the space that way. And we recently all joined Ellen McGirt's Race Ahead LinkedIn group, which has over 1,000 diversity and inclusion practitioners sharing their resources as well. The other one that is my go-to is CEOaction.com. So CEOaction.com was launched while I was working at PwC, and that really made my heart sing, because that was really companies stepping outside their walls to join together and say, we can't change the world by ourselves, but together we can make a huge impact, right? Our corner of the world, when combined, is huge. So CEO Action does a great job of sharing lessons learned and a bunch of free resources too, to help other companies accelerate in that space too.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna open it up. I know that Stacy has been pushing out, if you need to ask questions privately, if you don't feel comfortable posting them in the Q&A, that's fine too. We'll keep it anonymous. But the first question that I saw, you know, we've talked a lot about what leaders should be doing right now, but this pandemic will end at some point. And when it ends, there's going to be lasting effects on these specific employee populations, specifically Asian populations. So how would you advise people, leaders, D&I leaders, to measure the long-term impact of COVID on their workforce?
Well, right now it's hard to give them anything more to do when they're in the short term. They're just struggling to keep their heads above water. But as you think about coming out of it, I would think about making sure your decisions aren't disproportionately impacting a group unintentionally. So look for those biases that may be coming out, and make sure as diversity and inclusion leaders that you have a seat at the table, not only in the HR space or talent management space, but in the business decision space. So if companies are thinking about, okay, we're going to go back to the office and this is how we're going to roll it out, you're there to say, well, wait, we have large populations that ride the bus to work. Right, let's look at this from a socioeconomic perspective, right? Not everyone has a car. And what about all of the families that still have children at home? School is out for the rest of the year, right? So before we mandate everyone come back to the office, are we really tailoring our approach to what makes sense, right? And I know there's some hesitancy for some companies to continue from home, but I would ask them, if you've got high performers that were introverts that were actually more productive working at home without all the work interruptions, why wouldn't you continue that? Even on a trial basis, I used to pilot everything. If you say, let's pilot it, it's easier to get a yes. Let's pilot it for a few weeks versus let's make this permanent. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But most of the time when I pilot things, I try to predetermine the success of the pilot so that we keep it going.
Good. I love it. All right. One other question that we just received. So given political decisions that seem to be somewhat contrary to diversity and inclusion of late, what is one thing you think we can do to encourage our organizations or clients to maintain momentum and continue to progress forward with diversity and inclusion?
What's one thing? Oh dear. I like
or multiple things. Or multiple.
I know. Well, wishing out loud, right? I always ask the people. I want to wish out loud in multiple choice. But one thing is to stand and be counted. So I encourage our employees to self-identify. Even something as simple as the census, unless you identify, how can your voice be heard in the collective? So as an individual, I might be scared to say, hey, I'm a Chinese American if I think they're going to round me up. But thinking about, they need to know where we are because it has direct health policy impacts down the line if they don't realize where the concentrations of Pan-Asian talent are or in the communities that they serve, right? Even when we had the Ebola crisis here in Dallas, I still remember how those initial CDC warnings did not incorporate all the Asian languages as well, right? Until we pointed out, hey, look, the immigrants that are in that particular apartment complex speak over 31 different languages. You got to expand it beyond just Spanish and English. So I would say the one thing is encourage people to self-identify and be counted and be heard collectively. The other thing is creating those places. I don't say safe spaces, but I would say brave spaces for people to be a little bit more bold and say, this is what's on my heart, and that's okay. And I still struggle with it. I think we're all in works in progress, and I think creating a space that lets people know we don't have all the answers and we're all trying, I think that goes huge. I keep telling people we need more transparency, leadership, and caring. TLC works all the time.
Okay, love it, love it. So next question here. So I recently listened to your talk on the Beyond Barriers podcast about dreaming big and wishing out loud. You talked about being a talent gardener and helping people grow in their careers. During this time, many leaders are having to learn to adjust their approach to develop their remote employees. What are some leading best practices for people leaders to develop their employees in a remote environment?
I guess it's the same. To me, it seems the same whether we're in person or remote, right? Do you know what motivates your employees? I always ask, what do you need from me to do your best work? What's a small thing that would make a huge difference in your work experience here? What are your super skills that you're not being allowed to fully utilize here? I love that question about what's your super skills, because I found all sorts of people that could help me, especially on the diversity and inclusion front. Usually the diversity and inclusion leaders are sole practitioners even within their organization. All of a sudden I found someone who liked photography, someone that was great at videos, someone that was great at graphics. That's really helpful when you're trying to cascade a lot of things by yourself. So asking that question, whether it's virtual or in person, and getting to know people's hearts about where is your super skills that are not being fully utilized. You'd be surprised. People work in organizations and no one's looked at their resume in years, and they're in a job that's not making their heart sing, and they're like, hey, my strengths are here, and you're basically got a square peg in a round hole here, and I'm doing my best to fit in and feel fulfilled, but right now I'm not tapping into my purpose. And the companies that can tap into purpose and empathy are the ones that are going to accelerate their success coming out of this COVID situation.
Love it, love it, love it. All right. So the next question that I have here is asking more about the resources that you provided. They're asking, are there other resources that you would share in addition to the ones that you shared? I guess those were a good list. And we will make sure that we post all of the resources that Lisa shares with us on the Canary's website, and we'll also send it out when we send out the webinar. But are there any other resources, podcasts, books that you would recommend?
So particularly when dealing with grief, I have found a really, option B, the optionb.org website has been really helpful, not only for employees who are experiencing grief, but for employees who are trying to help others who are experiencing grief. And so given the high numbers of deaths, there's a high likelihood that you have employees who've had a relative or family member pass away. They have great short videos that really help understand the grief process and simple, small things to do, right? Instead of asking someone, how are you, when you know there's a death in the family, asking, how are you today, recognizing that they're taking one day at a time, but you care, right? Those small things make a big difference. The other website that comes to mind is Outsmarting Human Minds, because I like videos and free videos, and I love Harvard. So it's a Harvard website called Outsmarting Human Minds. And they have both podcast and short videos that are really thought-provoking, as well as the science behind unconscious bias. And I found that the more you talk about the science behind unconscious bias and how our brains are worked, most people feel like they can get their heads around that because it's not us versus them. We all have brains and we're all human. So the Outsmarting Human Minds one is a really helpful free resource.
Love it, love it. All right, so we're getting close on time here. I want to make sure that you have time to just share any final thoughts with everyone before we wrap up. So did you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to share with the group before we wrap up?
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for everyone's time and commitment to being an ally, right? It takes courage to do this work, and we need everyone, and we're stronger together. And we don't have all the answers, but being willing to say, I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to be here and to listen can make a huge difference. As a type A person, I always want to go, let's do, let's increase awareness and go straight to action. But sometimes just being present, not perfect, but just being present is what they need.
Love it. Thank you so much, Lisa, for being with us today. Thank you for being a beacon of light. And thank you for being, again, just a fantastic mentor. I love you so much. So thank you to all of our attendees for sharing your time with us today. We are so thankful for the questions that we had, the very thoughtful questions that we had. Our webinar series will be continuing. We will have several upcoming webinars over the next few weeks, and they'll range on very different topics, from how we address COVID-19 inclusion in higher education, to several other areas of impact. What we'd really love to have you do is please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn for news about different D&I trends and updates on future webinars. If you haven't already, please go ahead and share your LinkedIn profile with the others in the group through the chat function so that you can network with each other outside of this. Again, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope that everyone stays safe and healthy. Have an amazing day. Bye-bye.